Hey guys, welcome back to Planet Coaster. Today I'll be working on one building on this side of the main street, which is gonna have a number of facades. The biggest points of interest are probably the dome, which is the first thing that I'm working on in this video, and a small restaurant on the other side of the building, which is also gonna have a small dining area outside of it, though I do have to say about both these things, they are going to be quite basically the bare minimum of what I need for a building. Basically the buildings themselves, but nothing really around them. None of the signs of life to really make them feel alive and make them feel part of a theme park. So I won't actually get into planters or much decoration around them, or even lights or signs. I think I might actually want to save that for a real-time part at some point in the future. Even though I haven't actually done any real-time building, I think things like that might be somewhat fitting for it. But yeah, those are definitely things that I won't be getting into in this episode. It's mostly the construction of the buildings themselves, but not really anything or too much fancy around them. Anyway, this building, this dome building, was something that I really wanted to try for quite a long time, and I'm just a really big fan of classical buildings with domes. And it's something which I really thought wasn't too easily possible, but then I remembered basically that this brick piece is very versatile. And given that it's actually somewhat possible to make a decent sphere out of these things, I just wanted to give a dome corner building a try. It's very similar to the, or at least it's not similar, but I took some inspiration from the Metropolis building in Madrid, though definitely also from the common corner dome buildings which you see in cities like Paris as well. And it's just something which I wanted to try because I wanted to have something which would, like something special on the corner of the buildings instead of just keeping a very simple corner without any details on it, or having another tower, which I already have enough of, and I think it just fits the theme really well, and it's just something that I really wanted to try. And one of the issues that I do have with it is that you get these little ribs where the different pieces of the building come together, or where the pieces meet, because I inevitably end up with these pieces that don't entirely fit, and this has been one of my biggest worries really when it comes to combining any sort of object with any other sort of object to make something completely new, because as much as you can actually do with the objects which you have at the moment, there are some obvious LOD issues, which is a good topic to talk about later in this video, but you always have these little bits and bobs that you don't exactly want to have, but you inevitably end up getting because you want to get a certain shape from a certain element. Like, you want to use a certain element in a way that it's not meant to be used because it has a certain quality, a certain shape that you can use for that thing, but then it inevitably comes with something else, and that's really one of the biggest things that I really want to avoid. So even though there are some objects that I could really combine to make new things, there are just some combinations I want to avoid because they just end up looking a little bit messy. I try to at least keep things, well, somewhat clean, really. It's the idea that even though you can combine different pieces into making different things, I don't want it to become too obvious that you're using certain pieces for a certain use. Like, I would have to really compensate too much to get a certain use out of something, and I really was afraid I would get that with the dome, that even though I end up with a certain almost dome-like shape, it would still end up looking messy and just rough around the edges, which the current one certainly is. But then there's also the fact that I don't think it really looks too bad with these things sticking out on the sides, and it actually almost creates that sort of umbrella dome idea where you have these different ribs which stem out from the top of the dome, which go down and actually have the exact same location as the pillars, which is actually something that I'm really happy with in the end. I may still want to get back into the dome and maybe add some white ribs along the dome, which is something which you very commonly see in real buildings as well. Very similar to St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, for instance, but they're just really these small ideas which I like to play around with when I'm not recording. And you'll see I actually did play around with a number of things while I was recording this time-lapse, and eventually decided to actually take them out of the time-lapse. That's also something to keep in mind, perhaps. These videos take a little bit longer to record than the past ones, because this has, at least so far, the buildings in the main street have been more experimental than the buildings before this, and more of it, they've also been filled with more failures, basically. So there are just more pieces where things went wrong, and I decided to cut things out and go back to before I basically messed up stuff. and that's definitely what happened a couple of times. This is actually the second dome, and the first one turned out to be a little bit too low and had a bit more of a cone-like shape, which is something that I didn't want to really have, really wanted to get a better spherical shape out of this, and it actually took a couple of rebuilding domes to get the right shape. So this was, even though it looked like everything went flawlessly, there was definitely a little bit more time spent into this video than you can actually tell, which also makes it a little bit harder to make as many videos as I really would love to. And there was another thing which I wanted to say about that, but I think I just completely forgot about it. Oh yeah, something to also keep in mind is that this Mainstreet will just take much longer to build than the first one, and I'm really thinking somewhere between twice or 3 times as long, which for a Mainstreet isn't even that bad, especially if you compare it to the huge amount of time it would have taken in Roller Coaster Tycoon 3, but it does mean that I might break from building the Mainstreet every now and then if I really feel like it, and work on some different areas in the park and leave parts of the Mainstreet unfinished just for that time being, and maybe I'll just make it more of a thing which I chip at rather than try to complete it all in one go, and it's definitely something that'll be spread over a larger amount of time than the first Mainstreet was. But yeah, that's really just something to keep in mind, is that this might take quite a good number of episodes, and I might also just do some other things in the meantime. There are some other things which I still really want to get to, and I am partly getting to in this episode as well, which is really connecting the Mainstreet to the rest of the park. And I've gotten a couple of comments also about whether I would show off the park in an aerial perspective, just to get an idea of what the layout of the park is, which is a very good point. I haven't actually shown it off too much in the last couple of videos, and it's really hard to get an idea of what the overall park is laid out like, basically in the videos which I've recently made. And it's something which I think I'll just do in the real-time part of this video, but it's not going to be a focus and not something that I would love to do, well, a lot. Basically, since the park layout is also something that I am sort of planning some things, but it's far from finished at the moment, and it's just very rough and more of a sketch layout at the moment, especially since things aren't so well connected yet. So it's very unfinished and doesn't really look too great yet. There's only the basic things and centers are really done, like the station and surrounding area in the Japanese area, and the mountain and the station of the coaster in the Alpine area, but it's the parts in between that which are still very much unfinished and unconnected. So the layout isn't very completely finished and probably not really great enough to show off yet at this point, not to mention the big difference that foliage makes on it as well. Anyway, I actually had a better idea for the roofs in this building, which I'm actually quite happy with how it turned out in the end. It's definitely going to be a lot less poly heavy than the roofs which I had before, and that said though, they are definitely still poly heavy, and so are the roofs which I've built before, and so are the rocks. And I've been getting so many comments or discussions about this lately that I think it's something that I can also talk about. Because yeah, I have been using an excessive amount of LODs in the certain things, whatever I really build. But it's not really too big of a worry for me, in the sense that I don't want to compromise what I make just to get less, just to get less level of detail in the park. I'll certainly do it with foliage, which I do like to have just some simple tree lines and not too much shrubbery underneath the trees, but that's really just a realism aspect as well. But when it comes to certain things like sinking rocks into the ground just to make pebbles, or making mountains out of rocks, which is very costly on performance, I just don't really want to leave that out just to keep the frame rates high, because for me at least, I think the park itself is more important than how well the park is running. And even if that means that this is eventually going to have to not work on anyone's computer and be unrecordable, that's actually something I'll take, just because this is, it'll be still good for pictures, and it's been a really good practice and a lot of fun to work on in any case. But yeah, there are definitely certain areas where I could improve on my LOD usage and make it more efficient and less heavy on my CPU, but I'm just not really going to spend too much attention to that, really, since I don't think it's that important, and I don't really mind it too much. As long as the frame rate is still playable and click lag is not too bad. Anyway, this building here was also a building which I actually redid a couple of times as well. One of the things which I really struggled with were the spires, or the lack of spires really, and it's a really big thing really, since I'm just a really big fan of spires, but they're also quite prominent, especially on towers like this, and not being able to have spires, especially not in the color of the rest of the roof, or with any type of roof texture and their overall shape, really makes it a lot harder to make buildings like this. So I decided in the end to go with a structure which is very similar to the top of the tower on the other side of this path, basically the very tall tower, just to get the basic shape of a spire which goes up a bit, but still make it look somewhat more clean and like it actually has a certain style. I did try to make a spire actually in that place by using the wooden poles with the ropes on the side of them to actually make an angled spire, and while it's definitely possible to make an angled spire out of these ropes and place some small wall ornaments alongside them to shape out the spire shape, I just don't think it looks very clean, and it's something where I would rather go with something completely different, which might not look as great or might not be the thing which I planned, but still look somewhat realistic, than try to push things too far and make a spire out of completely unspire-like details just to get a spire in there. Basically, if something isn't really feasible enough and it isn't possible to make something look very close to realistic, I'll rather avoid it than try to go out of my way to make it happen somehow. There was also a bit of tweaking here on the main building, which is also something that I do have to get back to. It's exactly this type of tweaking that I usually leave out of time lapses, but I think it is quite a big game changer when it comes to what the building looks like. One of my main gripes with it was that the textures were all very similar and you could barely tell the details apart, and it was one very large building with all of the same colors, with those very the same shades of white and beige really, which sort of bothered me in a sense that there wasn't really anything popping out. There were many different details, but all very much in the similar textures and colors. So I was really trying to find a way to get some slightly darker colors in there. The only issue is that there isn't a slightly darker brown texture. It's either very light or very light white or beige, or the much darker brown textures of the stone and the wood. So I do feel a bit of a clash there, and it's something which I'll probably tackle in off-screen parts of whatever I'm doing when I'm working on the park. But it's just something that I'm at least working on, because even though there are probably definitely going to be people who like the tower more in just the very light and white colors, this is just something I want to try and see if there's at least some things I can improve on this, even though I will get back to the way it currently looks, because there's just too much contrast in the different colors in there. But yeah, I won't mess with it too much. I mean, it is the icon of Grizzly Valley, the weenie, if you will, because I haven't dropped that word enough times yet, so I definitely don't want to touch it too much, and I'm quite happy with how it looks at the moment. Just, it's something that I kind of like to go back to things and spend hours just tweaking the smallest of little details to see what certain things would just be a little bit better than what I had before, and just to make it pop out a little. I also have to say, I actually think adding the darker details, especially in the pillar, makes it look a little bit better and pop out a little bit more from this perspective, but then coming like from the perspective of the little plaza with the fountain in the middle of it from the main street itself, it doesn't fit as much with the rest of the building, which is still very light. So that's also something that I may well get back to. But yeah, this is basically the restaurant and the last building of this video, and also very similar to the other buildings in this same facade. It's also the building of which I really can't pinpoint whatever sort of style it should really be. The earlier dome building was quite obviously drawn from some Mediterranean and French influences, but this building I really don't have much of a clue. I just started off with a general shape of what I wanted to have and tried some random things, just with the general same details of the buildings which I already had. But aside from that, I really don't... Well, I'm just not really able to say much about the idea behind this building. It was just some random things that I just wanted to give a try. It almost looks Dutch, I would say. But yeah, for lack of a better description, I think I'll just call this building, and perhaps also the entire Main Street, just make it an eclectic theme and go with that. Because truth be told, there are also just many parts where I just tried different things with the in-game objects, and just by using these colonial objects in a completely different type of building, you get some really unidentifiable buildings, basically, is what I was trying to think of. It's also getting surprisingly harder every time to come up with a new type of idea for the top of the building, because there are lots of pieces at the moment, but the lack of spires makes it quite tough to actually come up with a unique top of building, and I do want to at least have unique details, and especially for towers like these buildings have, which are very prominent, I do want to try and get some different ways of making them with every one that I make. But it's getting increasingly hard, and it's gonna probably get increasingly strange and unique along the way as well. In perhaps a bit of a Disney sense, I should say. As I've also stated, I think in the description of the last video, I could perhaps say that I've sort of ended up with a very unique Grizzly Valley type of theme in doing all of these random things, and coming eventually it having turned out as a very unique style and not really extremely related to anything else in real life. But yeah, this is basically the restaurant, in perhaps then I should say Grizzly Valley in theme, though it is still very similar to the building on the other side of this tower on the corner there, and definitely so in having the bricks on the bottom floor with white walls on the top floor, and having that same roof structure with balconies and the little roof sticking out on above the ground floor, I should say. First floor, ground floor things are still very confusing to me as a Dutchman, though I've understood from Conflict Nerd it's definitely not related to non-native English speakers. Anyway, I wanted to have like a little plaza in front of this restaurant as well, so that's why it really feels like a building that faces to the front much more than a Main Street building, which is one of the reasons why I also wanted to have that tower in front of it and have it stick out a little bit, and rather than going to some sort of central point, have it lean forward more with that almost Dutch-like little gable thing on the front of it, just to make the building much more than a regular Main Street building, which is also much more narrow, make it really seem to point forward and have this very, distinct, real place toward the front of the building, where I want to keep it quite open by having a small area with some tables and stuff like that, and really have this building almost as a local weenie as well. Not to mention that I also wanted to have this little row of arches here, which isn't really an aqueduct, which is something that I got many requests for as well, and I did try it, but the issue is, part of the issue is that having a one tile wide building in this space would barely fit and make things way too crammed, and also by adding another row of arches above these arches, the aqueduct would actually become very tall and would actually make the zero-G roll behind it almost completely invisible. So just because it looks a little bit better composition wise, I wanted to actually have this row of arches there, but then still have the zero-G roll actually still tower above it and have that still be very visible, which is something that I just wanted to have. So it isn't entirely a realistic aqueduct there, but it's something which I wanted to compromise a little for. And these are basically the very simple layouts of the tables here, where you can actually see the restaurant building from straight ahead. I just wanted to have some simple fences around it and one small tea pavilion, or tea house I should call it. But aside from that, not really anything special, just a simple plaza with some tables, much like perhaps Casey's Corner in Disney, except this isn't so very symmetrically placed at the end of the main street, but I still wanted to have some places where people can eat at the end of the main street, especially given that in the rest of this area I don't see really any opportunities to have another restaurant, and given how close this is to the main street, it's probably the best part, and it's also something that I wanted to do just because this was my favorite shot actually of the main tower and the main weenie of the park, being from the side like this with the other buildings on the right and the blue coaster on the left, which is a shot that I absolutely loved. So I wanted to keep this area quite open and devoid of trees or attractions just to have that cool shot really of the building behind it. Though I did want to add a small tea house just to make this entire area feel not so deserted and not feel like one big open plaza and one big field with nothing in it really, so just a very simple tea house, which I did struggle with a little bit. I would have loved to actually make this an iron sort of nouveau art kind of tea house with lots of ironworks and classic details, but alas there's no way to really get that in at the moment, so decided to go with a almost Asian looking with roofs like this tea house, which I at some point later just replaced with roofs that actually curve upwards, or downwards I should say, just to get rid of that very Asian feel of it. But yeah, this is the little tea house. Pretty simple, but just something that I wanted to have here to fill in this area, and to have a building which would not make the tower invisible behind it, and not make the tower seem smaller, but just have a building which doesn't really pull too much attention to itself, but still fills up the area and makes it feel a little bit more alive and populated. So yeah, that's really the idea behind the simple tea room. Perhaps it's also just a really nice place to eat, but yeah, I don't have time to care for that. It's really just there to look good and not to be very useful, to be quite honest. And last but not least, there were a couple of things which I tried with tables before and really figured in the end, hell, there were even a couple of things which I tried with tables over here, and I figured in the end the best combination might actually be the little fountain thing with the supports. And then I was actually thinking I could use the supports as small chairs, which I've definitely seen other people do before as well, but it has that very industrial feeling to it. So decided to go in the end with these small wooden blocks, which even though they're still far from realistic chairs, and I would have loved to actually have some more light chairs, or even especially ironwork chairs would be really cool in this sense. We just don't have those things in the game, at least yet. So yeah, that'll be it for today. So thank you guys for watching, though I do still have one very small real-time part just left, which I think I'll show. So thank you guys for watching, and on to real-time Silverette. Okay, so just because this is a little bit better to show off what the park looks like than time-lapse, I just wanted to have a small real-time part in which I show off stuff, but I'm not actually gonna build stuff like I thought I might do, since the lighting is gonna take quite a lot of time, and there's just so much unfinished stuff in here that I'm just gonna do all of that in time-lapses basically. There were the number of changes which I added to the tower over here, which I'm still not happy with. The main issue is that I want to have some different colors in there, but the arches are just extremely dark, so that's some stuff I'll like tweak off screen, along with some other things like the backs of these buildings and doing some of the more boring stuff I think, which doesn't have as much of a sense of progression in it, is going to be done off screen, and I'll just keep the main stuff for the time lapses. Now this is the dome building over here, which is still a bit simple. It needs some signs and stuff of life. I did add the Chief Beef, or I was gonna say Chief Beef Belief. I did add some of the Chief Beef signs and stuff over here just to make this feel a bit more alive, but I didn't actually get started on these buildings here. And then there's the other side with the restaurants over here, and what is by far my favorite angle. And also something to keep in mind is that I did want to make it this way since, well, yeah, I'm gonna have to say it again. This building is really a pretty big weenie if you're looking from this area. Like, obviously it's a pretty important, whoops, if I can actually control the camera for a second. It's a pretty important area with having a pretty large restaurant so close to the entrance. So I did want to make sure you had a pretty good view of the tower here, and this has to be my favorite view, I think. It really, I don't know, it really comes out very well in this shot. And you have all of these towers and the domes on it as well. And as you approach from the Roman area, in between the little aqueduct kind of thing and the 0G roll, you can actually see the towers straight ahead. So that's something that I kind of like as well. And I also want to keep this area, or at least this sightline, clear over here, because you really have that straight look onto the restaurant, as I explained before. And what's also pretty cool actually, and what I actually forgot to mention about the little pavilion, is that the castle actually comes out perfectly if you're looking from over here into the gap between these buildings, and almost comes out as a sort of Disney castle. So this is definitely a line that I also want to keep quite empty, which is going to be quite easy since there is the coaster and the path over there. And so you'll basically be able to actually see the castle from over here already as well. But aside from that, I really don't know what I'm going to do exactly with the rest of the area. There's still a lot to do on the main streets, not just on adding new buildings, but also on the existing buildings. And there's also so much to do around the main street just to make it all come together. I sort of promised I would actually give an overview of the park, because I haven't actually done that in any latest videos. So this is what it looks like, maybe just a bit closer to have no very awkward tree LODs. So this is what it basically looks like and is laid out like, and like I said, it really has a much more organic layout, and at some points just completely random and not planned at all, and much more in a layout type of sense. I would compare it to, for instance, Busch Gardens, because it still has some quite dense theming. Busch Gardens Williamsburg, probably, considering the theming. And yeah, that's basically what I think of it. I would really love to do a Disneyland park at some point, but I think the fantasy theme is going to be pretty useful for that, and not to mention the new stuff that comes out. And water. One of the important things actually in laying out a park, I find, is water. Nearly every single theme park has at least some bodies of water, and they like to especially be scattered around lakes, or use lakes and little ponds in their layout, like especially Universal Studios or Disney. So that's something which I'm really looking forward to, and actually makes it somewhat harder, I guess, to get a good park layout. Also considering the fact that there's no real terraforming yet, so all of the terraforming that isn't here has to be done with rocks, which isn't the greatest either. So you don't really get that play between different heights of paths or attractions, or the water and land, and create some awesome scenes with that. But yeah, overall I'm still very happy with how this turned out. So in the next episode, I'm not entirely sure, since I'll probably just jump to whatever I like doing, but I think it's about damn time that I start connecting this area, actually finish this off, and fix the transition around the Roman area as well, and really make the park come together with more foliage and rockwork and paths and some little bits and bobs here and there which are still just unfinished and grassland at the moment. So yeah, thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you next time.